A review code for this game was provided by the devs at Team 7th Star. This will not affect my thoughts on the game as a whole, but you all have the right to know that I received this product for free. And thanks to the developers for making this my first review code ever. So, in the last few weeks, there have been a lot of games coming out. Sonic Superstars, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, Spider-Man 2, and there's still a lot more coming up in these next few months. You may have heard me mention that I plan to review all three of those previously mentioned games at some point, plus Super Mario RPG and Persona 5 Tactica, but since those three came out so close to when this video was supposed to release, I knew that I'd have to review something else before then. Originally, I ran a poll to see what you'd like me to review, and Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury came out on top there. And while I'll probably finish that video at a later date, right as I was in the process of scripting it, the developers of Code Bunny reached out and asked me to do a review of their game. I'd actually heard about this game a few times before this. I knew it had gotten some attention at this year's Sonic Amateur Games Expo, or SAGE, where they released the final demo for the game. One of my favorite streamers, SpaceyBat, was highlighting some of the games from the expo, and I managed to catch her stream of the demo. Eventually, she'd go on to stream the full game once it released, and I tuned in for part of that as well. Each time, I was drawn a bit more to the game. It had some really adorable character designs, great sprite work on the stages, and really charming interactions between the characters that caught my attention. I didn't initially plan to play through the game this soon. I had a lot on my plate with the looming rise of Gamer Week, leading to a pretty empty wallet, plus school kicking my butt and taking up a lot of my free time. Upon receiving my review code and realizing how short the game was, however, I figured I'd let this take the place of my Mario 3D World review, at least for now. That ended up working out pretty well anyways, since I was running significantly behind on that video after it ended up being a much larger commitment than I anticipated. So anyways, here we are with Code Bunny. Developed by the Latin America-based Team 7th Star, this game follows two Banui protagonists in a futuristic world as they work with the Vi space program to take down a suspicious group known as Mad Bunny. I can't say much else about the story without getting into spoiler territory, but we will talk about this later in the video, and I'll give a warning before that comes up. The game is a 2D platformer primarily influenced by the likes of the Mega Man Zero and ZX games, but the devs have stated they also drew some inspiration from the likes of Sonic the Hedgehog, Azure Striker Gunvolt, and Freedom Planet. And if you're familiar with my channel, that last one should definitely catch your attention, as my longest project to date was a review of Freedom Planet 2 that released back in June. So, for a game drawing inspiration from that series, consider my expectations for the game set slightly above average. The game offers two modes of play, Story Mode and Classic Mode. Story Mode naturally delves further into the game's narrative with short breaks between most stages, while Classic Mode lets you blaze straight through from stage to stage. Considering the average Story Mode playthrough only takes about 2 hours maximum, I'd recommend starting with that and then switching to Classic Mode if you're trying to get better ranks or times on the stages. And, as I mentioned earlier, there are two protagonists, with each of them playing significantly different from the other. And though their stories start very similarly, and they play through mostly the same stages, they offer very different perspectives on the narrative, especially in the second half of the game. You're not really getting the full story of the game unless you've played as both of them. First, we have Hazel, who I would recommend you play as first. She has a standard 4-hit combo with her sword, as well as upward and downward directional attacks for standard combat. She has an incredibly useful tool to get in on an enemy, too. By firing an arrow at an enemy, she'll lock onto them, and pressing L1 will send you on a dash attack straight toward that enemy. This is used for some really fun platforming challenges, and is also a great tool to start attacking bosses. Additionally, Hazel features a parry, plus the ability to survive otherwise fatal attacks with 1 health remaining. She also has this karma meter in the bottom left corner of the screen, but I wasn't quite able to understand how this worked in my playtime. Hazel's skill guide was unfinished when I played through the game, and information on this game online is pretty scarce, so I have no resources to try and get a better understanding of this mechanic. From what I got though, I think it's that the more enemies you kill, and the higher a combo you get, the more damage you do, but you'll also build up the amount of damage you take the next time you get hit. So Hazel is a really fun risk-reward character with some great mobility in combat. On the other side, we have Axel. No, not that Axel. This one has an E in his name. Axel has much more slippery controls than Hazel, due to his experience as a figure skater, but this also allows him to bounce off enemies with his spin attack, stomp on them for more precise platforming, and build up his EX meter, which unlocks some additional attacks for Axel. See, his standard combo is extremely close range and does relatively low damage. Some of these attacks aim to rectify that weakness. These attacks are directionally mapped, with the downward one resulting in a dive kick that does a lot of damage, the forward one acting as a sort of boosted charge attack, and the upward one acting as a sort of double jump. This makes Axel a far more mobile character than Hazel, in exchange for being slightly harder to use in combat. This is exemplified by the fact that Axel's standard attacks deplete his EX gauge, encouraging you to bounce off enemies to build it up more and use those far more powerful attacks. Essentially, Hazel's your go-to if you like combat and boss fights, while Axel is far better for traversal and platforming. I really like this distinction between the two of them, because even when they're playing through the same levels, it makes each of their approaches to the stage feel wholly unique. Speaking of the levels, there are 9 in total, with 5 of them being shared between the two protagonists, 2 being standard stages that are exclusive to each character, and the last 2 being story stages with a boss fight that are also character-specific. And considering that these stages, on average, last around 3 to 6 minutes, this means that the game is very short, taking only an hour or 2 to finish a single playthrough depending on your skill level. A game's length isn't necessarily indicative of its quality though. A short, well-designed game can end up leaving far more of an impact than a 100-hour RPG. It's all about how effectively the game uses its time. And on that front, I'd say Code Bunny uses its short runtime expertly. The controls and game mechanics are relatively simple, but have a lot of depth toward them. Almost every stage has some kind of unique gimmick that makes it feel fresh all the way through, with my favorites being the wind currents in Yokkaido and these teleporting hats in Wonderland. I do think some of these gimmicks can be a bit jarring to use, particularly the hats, as they warp you and the camera instantly, forcing you to react immediately, and these could have done with a bit of touching up to make their use a bit smoother. The stage layouts themselves are also very well designed, with a ton of branching routes that really encourage you to master the game's mechanics. I can definitely see where the game's Sonic inspiration was put to use, with the higher routes of stages generally being faster but more difficult to maintain, while the lower routes are slower as a punishment for the player missing a jump or getting hit by an enemy. Additionally, each of the characters' exclusive stages are my personal favorites in each of their playthroughs, putting their abilities to expert use that I don't really see utilized in many of the other stages, since they have to be designed to accommodate both of them. I feel that adding more exclusive routes within the stages based on which character you're playing as would have benefited this level design greatly, which are generally pretty fun, putting you to the test with both characters' mobility and challenging you with dodging barrages of attacks in order to get a hit in on them. Hazel is generally better at these thanks to her parry and it also being able to block projectiles, as well as the aforementioned dash attack that homes in onto enemies you've marked. The bosses are also ranked separately from the rest of the stage, which is something I really appreciate, since in many other games, if you're going for a high rank on a stage with a tough boss fight, perfecting the stage only to have to also spend so much time perfecting the boss at the end, and then do them back to back, can be a bit unfair. Here, you can just master each of them individually, and still get those high rankings on each of them. And while we're on the subject of the ranking system, I think it's a really smart way to encourage replay value in a game like this. The system is really strict if you want to get those higher ranks, not only requiring no death runs for S ranks, but also no damage runs for the game's highest S+ ranks. And when the stages, and the game as a whole, are as short as they are, it makes replaying a bunch of it to get these higher ranks feel very rewarding. One complaint I do have about the game is the lack of enemy variety, though. As soon as you complete the second level, Forest of Morag, you've already seen most of the enemies you'll encounter throughout the game. These invulnerable ladybugs you can use to help with platforming, these stubby little hopping bunny bots, these bee-looking bunnies. Dang, they weren't kidding when they said this world was full of bunnies. There are a few different enemy types that'll get introduced later, like these robots that jump and bounce on these little hats in Wonderland, but these are few and far between, and the game mostly sticks to its established enemies. I feel like if there was some kind of aesthetic variation between these enemies depending on what stage you're currently in, it would go a long way to make them not feel as monotonous, while also not being as hard on the developers as creating fully unique enemies for every stage would. Speaking of aesthetics, one of this game's strongest aspects is its art style and sprite work, which is simplistic but still top-notch. Despite how small their sprites are, there's still a ton of little details in them, and it makes it really fun to watch them move. Some of my favorite animations are Hazel's standard combo, Igusa's animation of shaking Hazel's hand in this intro cutscene, and this animation where Raffi pulls her goggles down to start welding stuff in their home base. And now that we're discussing some of the expanded cast of characters, I should probably start discussing the story. Overall, I'd say the plot is perfectly serviceable. The character dialogue is very well written, which is exemplified by these optional talk room scenes you can view between stages. But the progression of some plot points is extremely fast-paced, and it really feels like this game's plot fits more in a slightly longer game. Some of the elements of the story definitely should have been trimmed down to fit the length of the game more. The scope of what you can tackle with a story is definitely determined by how long the game is. I'm assuming this game's story was inspired by the Mega Man Zero games, which I have yet to fully give a try despite owning the Legacy Collection. Maybe I'll review those games sometime. But from what I've heard, those games are fairly good at balancing story scope with game length, and are able to build up their lore to the point they do because they draw from the previous lore of the X series, plus build up their own over the course of 4 games. Here though, you only have roughly 3 to 4 hours to tell the whole story, and most of that time is going to be spent in gameplay, so it's crucial to limit the story to something that's achievable in that time frame. Here though, a lot of the major elements aren't properly introduced until the game's last 2 stages, and that makes the story feel rushed and a bit overscoped, at least at that ending point. I think the story should have focused more on the characters within it, rather than the eventual reality-shattering crisis that the game proceeds toward. But that's about all I can say without getting into spoiler territory, so if you want to avoid those, skip to the next chapter of the video so you don't have to hear anything you don't want to. And with that, let's dive into some story spoilers. So, Hazel and Axel share the same story for the first few stages of the game, tracking down the members of the organization Mad Bunny at the orders of their employer, Lagos Hyperbolics. Working with them are the aforementioned Igusa and Raffi, and the interactions between these 4 are some of the very best parts of the story. You can definitely tell the writers have a passion for writing character dialogue, and most of the story does lean into this strength. This is exemplified when Hazel's story splits off after Yokkaido, where she encounters an old friend who reveals that Lagos is hiding something pretty big from Hazel. With her eventually uncovering they've been creating clones of her to use as soldiers for some major plan. Once Hazel takes them out, she teams up with the members of Mad Bunny to stop the plans of Lagos' CEO, Soleil Lumiere. The story eventually begins to dive into Hazel and Shoko's past, revealing that Hazel killed a mutual close friend of theirs when he attempted to defect from the army they worked for. I think this part of the plot is a really good way to expand on Hazel's character, but unfortunately, after this is when the story starts to fall apart a bit. See, earlier in the game, it's established that most of this world's energy comes from shards of the comet Euliaster, and Soleil, Igusa, and Loon, another member of Mad Bunny, have warped into the comet's core. Soleil wants to use the comet's power to bring her loved one, Melius, back from the dead. But in the process, the comet shows her the truth, essentially revealing that reality is all just, quote, a dream. And this is where the game loses me. Suddenly, for this short last portion of the game, it gets extremely philosophical and starts diving into the nature of the game world's reality. And it's just like, this doesn't mean anything to me. The game has spent all this time building up character relationships that only end up playing into the story by Hazel getting to say, "I have friends and a reason to live now," to the main bad guy. Which is even harder to believe when Axel is one of the main friends she references here, and yet Axel and Hazel only share one major scene together in the entire game. In Axel's story, this ending is a lot more impactful due to his own character relationships, but here it just serves to make the plot needlessly complicated, which leaves the ending feeling just a bit hollow. I feel like it would have been a lot more meaningful had Hazel and Axel both been present for the ending, rather than letting the other protagonist literally disappear from your game's story after the halfway point. Because yeah, after their stories split, neither Axel nor Hazel interact at all for the rest of the game. And I think that's a real shame, because it would have been great to see them reunite after all of their character development, and show how those changed the brief friendship they formed. Anyways, circling back around to Axel's story, his split involves learning that Loon, that Mad Bunny member that I mentioned earlier, was actually his sickly brother he'd thought long dead. Soleil decided to use him for her experiments, since he was dying from the same disease that Melius did, and in the process, she erased his memories and fashioned him into her own weapon. Of course, eventually he defected to Mad Bunny in an attempt to foil her plans, but eventually he's roped into the whole comet situation in a way the plot actually doesn't make very clear. But as Axel discovers this, and is forced to come to terms with the fact that his brother is not only alive, but isn't the same person he knew, it makes his story a lot stronger narratively. Plus, we have him dealing with the fallout of Raffi's loyalty to Soleil and Lagos as a whole, which builds up a far more convincing friendship between those two than his friendship with Hazel ever was. One last thing to mention, though, is the killer soundtrack for this game. Composed entirely in FamiTracker, it's full of excellent 8-bit songs that complement the gameplay very well. Some of my personal favorites are, again, Yokkaido's theme, and also the theme for Hazel's Lagos HQ stage. Overall, though, Code Bunny is a short but sweet action game with fun mechanics and a charming story, held back only by a slightly too ambitious ending. For it being only $10, I'd say this game is well worth your time and energy if you're a fan of these sorts of games. I'd like to thank the team at 7th Star once again for giving me the opportunity to review their game, and thank you viewers for letting me take my last scheduled upload period off. I really needed a break, school's been going crazy. With that said, don't forget to like, subscribe, all the usual YouTuber crap. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Code Bunny if you've played it, and I'll see you for whatever game my next video ends up being on. Have a fantastic day.